Welcome back to Houston Newsmakers, where we've been talking about the start of the Trump administration. Much has been made about the ability of the incoming president to do away with or drastically change the executive orders signed by President Obama. What do each of you make about how far this president may go in terms of what he plans to do as he sits down starting in the Oval Office this week?
Well, President-elect, or now President Trump, has made the case that he's going to repeal all of the executive orders that he considers to be unconstitutional. Now, he's not likely to repeal all of them, but there are certain ones, such as the DACA plan that allowed undocumented immigrant children to obtain legalized status and get on the pathway to citizenship. That's one that could be in jeopardy, and that would have an impact on over 700,000 people throughout the country, including hundreds of thousands here in Texas. He's not going to be able to do it with all of them, but in terms of things like DACA, I think that's one that has a lot of people concerned.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are some high-profile ones that have run the ire of Republicans. Most presidents, though, frankly, don't spend a lot of time revoking executive orders in their first 100 days. The first and highest we saw was with President Reagan at 20. Beyond that, going back to Roosevelt, it doesn't happen very frequently beyond the 20 number. So you're going to see some of those high-profile ones taken away, but there's some that I think he'll keep, which I think is really important. So there are some that are designed to create and enhance jobs for people who have disabilities or veterans, and so those are the ones that I think they'll actually keep, in addition to the ones that he's going to have to probably eliminate politically.
President Obama says he's going to ride off into the sunset, take some time off, but he's planning on maybe coming back if he sees things that happen, such as DACA, if he sees wholesale removing of people. So we'll see how that works. What do you make about the relationship potentially between the United States and the world now, with some of the things that President Trump has said leading into this administration?
Well, I think we're set for a very different relationship with Mexico. Mexico is one of our most important trade partners, and it's very important for Texas. But President Trump has a conflictual relationship with them on two levels: on the immigration level and border security, where he wants to put up a wall or at least some type of barrier and make the Mexican government pay for it, but also in terms of issues of trade, where he wants to keep U.S. companies from going to Mexico and taking U.S. jobs to Mexico and bringing some of those jobs back. So from the very start, we're looking at a very rocky relationship with Mexico. And then China is the other big sort of elephant in the room, where to figure out how far is Trump going to go in terms of pressuring China in terms of its closed borders and tariffs, and opening itself up to trade and currency manipulation.
And we have Mexico, China, you talked about. We also have Europe, and we also have the Middle East as well as a part of this process.
I think part of the reason that President-elect Trump has had trouble getting the national security team in place is that he has taken positions which are so different from the kind of current administration, but even past administrations, right? He's talking about pulling back from NATO. He's talking about redoing trade arrangements, like Mark said. He's got his own opinions about what national security briefing should do, and he said that he knows more than the generals do. So I think that there are potential problems inside the White House, and then sort of compounded with that outside the White House, right? I mean, if you're jeopardizing your relationship on trade with Mexico, then it could destabilize the rest of your trade arrangements. If you're having a difficult relationship with China, how are you going to deal with North Korea, which has sort of served as a buffer? So the Russia situation is the same way. If you aren't able to handle things in Syria, you need Russia to help you. But if you're too much in their pocket, or if you perceive to be too close to them and the Republicans push back, how does the president handle that? So all these interconnected problems are of the president's own making, but it's certainly the case that he has put a new spin on how globally things are going to work.
Well, you said it's a populist president. So now, based upon that, how should this president be judged in terms of his success or failure? It's going to be a different kind of, maybe a measuring stick for him?
I think he'll be judged in terms of jobs and economic growth, and especially as Republicans move into the 2018 midterms, the overall success of the Trump presidency will have a down-ballot impact on the extent to which Republicans are likely to keep the Senate, although I think they're looking more at expanding their seats in the Senate as opposed to seeing reduced. And then also, how do Republicans do in state legislatures and governor races across the country? And that will hinge heavily on the success or failure of the Trump presidency.
What's your take on it?
I think that makes sense. I think that all presidents are judged on peace and security, as well as on economic stability. And if he can get the economy working for everybody, as opposed to just sort of some segments, which was part of the reason that he was able to communicate and be successful in the election, and if he can make things happen on the international stage and improve situations that are going in bad directions. I think too that that in terms of Texas, that the Trump presidency could prove to be a boon for Democrats. I think that the ability for the Democrats to sharpen their message against the Trump message, which has been exclusive and which has sort of pushed away some of the key groups that the Democratic Party wants to emphasize in Texas, I think that there's potential there. So although I think it's difficult for a Republican Party to pick up seats in midterms, it's certainly going to be the case that Democrats are looking to find a way to be able to use the Trump message as a way to kind of push back on the Republican Party broadly.
Well, I think it's very interesting, this populist president that we have now, so many people who are really very excited about this new president and his administration will be watching it. You should know that President Obama asked all of his cabinet members to write an exit memo, and I'm going to put the link to that exit memo to my webpage here, so you can take a look at it. You can see what they think that they've achieved as compared to what your image is of what they've achieved. I think you have to have the facts so you can judge them for yourself about how this past administration's done and how this new administration is going to do as well. Professor Mark Jones, Brandon Rottinghouse, thank you for helping start this conversation. Look forward to having you with me as we watch this process continue over the next few years.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in. We appreciate it.